Y las moriscas.
Hello and welcome to Islam in the Middle Ages, a series for IHSHG, examining the Islamic world from Muhammad to the Mughal Empire on the first Sunday of each month. In the last episode, we saw the dramatic rise and fall of the Umayyad Caliphate, as well as the crystallization of Islamic power in the regions of early conquest. Today, we'll pick up where we left off last time and examine the Abbasids, the remarkable dynasty that succeeded them and went on to rule the Caliphate for 300 years afterwards. The Abbasids are one of the most iconic dynasties in the history of the Islamic world. It was in this period that some of the most famous contributions from Islamic luminaries to the wider world, such as the scientific advances of Islamic scholars or the literary work 1001 Nights, came into being. Additionally, the Abbasid Caliphate was arguably the greatest world power from the middle of the 8th to the start of the 10th centuries, spanning a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its height. In this period too, Baghdad was one of the greatest centers of trade and scholarship in the world, housing a line of caliphs that would hold the title until the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent claimed it for himself in 1517. Furthermore, many of the precedents laid down in this period would have long-lasting consequences for the world of Islam for hundreds of years to come. If it was under the Umayyads that the Islamic world began to crystallize into the form that would endure throughout our period, it was under the Abbasids that many of its contours would take their final shape. However, like the Umayyads before them, the Abbasids too were a nascent dynasty that faced the challenges of running a complicated, fractious network of rulers, a challenge that was only growing in this period as the Islamic world became larger and richer than it ever had before. Many of the political issues that we have already seen will resurface here, as well as the new challenges that came from the situation the new dynasty found itself in, and its response. The Abbasid strategy that focused on centralization of power in a new capital provided opportunities and challenges of its own. And whilst it propelled the caliphal office to new heights, the centralization of power also created a concentrated center of authority that both bred resentment and attracted opportunists. This period was therefore a dynamic time for the Islamic world, and it must be remarked that I am especially excited to be sharing this with you today. I should stress now, though, that, as with all our episodes, this is a general introduction to this period. There are many fascinating subjects that will be covered in this episode that deserve detail on their own, and in the future we will be revising some of the remarkable threads that we'll be touching on today. For now, though, we'll be looking at the period on a more broad, brushstroke basis. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the IHSHG, and I would like to thank them for giving me the platform to be able to host this. Do be sure to check out their website, Facebook page, and YouTube channels for more historical discussions in English and Portuguese. So, let's begin. As you may recall from the last episode, the Abbasids came from Khorasan, a region in eastern Iran. This was an area far away from the centers of power in Syria and Iraq, and close to the Silk Road cities of Central Asia, where a blend of ideas and intellectual cultures could flow as easily as the goods that travelled through there. It was here that the faction, with their links to the Prophet's uncle Abbas, were able to mount a counterclaim to the Caliphate against the declining Umayyads, calling for a restoration of the proper adherence to the Quran and Hadith that the Umayyads had sullied. In 750, Al-Mansour came to power as the first Caliph of this dynasty, although he cemented his rule 13 years later, after the last of the resistance movements that sprung up in the final moments of Umayyad power, a decade beforehand, were finally quashed by his armies. Al-Mansour was an ideal choice for a man to start the dynasty. He was religiously and financially austere, and able to manage the delicate balance of power of his ascension. He balanced the interests of both the Khorasani faction that swept him to power with the old Iraqi and Syrian elites that had now been displaced, as well as his own mercenary army that would become to be known as the Abna, or sons. Al-Mansour also oversaw a rapid expansion of caliphal finances by directing to the caliphal coffers the two major kinds of taxation within the caliphate: the land tax, known as kharaj, as well as the jizya, levied on religious minorities such as Christians and Jews. What had once been the privilege of conquering emirs was now centered on the core of power, so the Caliph could direct the enormous funds generated to the betterment of his lands as a whole. In addition to this, the Caliph also began a process that reached its height from 780 to 840, that saw the expansion of the Caliph's official bureaucracy. Secretaries, or kutab in Arabic, began to be organized into specialized offices, or diwans, that dealt with different facets of state. All of this was directed by a chief minister known as a wazir, the first of which was Al-Mansour's colleague, Abu Ayyub. The wazir took over the executive duties of the Caliph and managed the collection of revenue from taxation. Governors of provinces, however, and their appointments, sat in the hands of the Caliph alone, in order to counter the new minister's power. This was an ambitious overhaul of the structure of government, giving rise to a system of bureaucrats that easily rivaled ancient Rome for both its size and its complexity. It's worth noting, though, that the relationship between the wazir and Caliph wasn't always cordial, and the wazir had other positions of power to contend with, such as the hajib, the chamberlain of the Caliph's household staff, who was also close to the center of power, just as he was. As we will see, one of the unfortunate side effects of the growth of power in this period was also the rise of bitter rivalry and infighting over the increasingly lucrative and wealthy centers of power that the court at Baghdad was able to offer. In addition to his further reforms, Al-Mansour also oversaw a major image overhaul of the Caliph's legitimacy. On his speech to accession, he made it clear that he would not rule as a partisan political figure and try to interfere with religious rulings, like the Umayyads did, and took a number of practical steps in order to ensure this. The role of qadis and muftis, legal experts to deal with the increasingly complicated corpus of precedents under Sharia law, expanded under the new dynasty, and they became increasingly prestigious figures of power in the cities in which they operated. Al-Mansour also stopped the precedent of giving caliphal decrees on religious matters, allowing legal experts and a growing corpus of hadith to take over this faction for good. Finally, in a curious move, he also executed his own general in 755 to ensure he cut ties from anyone that could leverage power over him. Arguably, however, Al-Mansour's greatest achievement was the foundation of Baghdad, the new capital, in 762. The city, originally known as the Madinat as-Salam, the City of Peace, was a capital par excellence that was able to command greater wealth and population than Damascus, due to a mixture of good location, careful planning, and the rapid accumulation of talented individuals from across the Islamic world. The city was located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in close distance to the fertile lands such as the Jazira and Sawad, which when combined with the irrigation system the two rivers provided, produced an agricultural surplus that surpassed even that of Egypt, the agricultural centre of the Mediterranean, since the time of ancient Rome, and arguably even before that. The city, too, was well away from the traditional bases of power in Iraq that could sway caliphal power, such as Kufa and Basra, as well as en route to trading paths to China, the Indian Gulf, Persia, and cities that were vital stops on the Silk Road, such as Bukhara, Samarkand, and Nishapur, as well as routes to Syria and Hejaz in Arabia to the west. The result was a remarkably attractive city that eventually created a huge, bustling network of scholars, merchants, and political figureheads. By the mid-9th century, due to its wealth, the Abbasid Caliphate was arguably the strongest state in the world at the time. The only possible rival to this claim, the Tang dynasty of China, had been destabilized by this point by a military coup and lost a lot of the strength that it had commanded in the centuries prior. It may interest the listener to know that the Abbasids may have even had a small part to play in this downfall, to their victory at the Battle of Talas in 750, which, as you may recall from the first episode, finalized the Caliphate's eastern border. Therefore, from a promising start, with good reforms to strengthen the state, Al-Mansour was able to usher in an era of relative peace from the 760s onwards, a trend that would continue with his two successors, his son Al-Mahdi and his grandson Harun al-Rashid, the only caliph to be mentioned in the famous collection of stories Alf Layla wa Layla, or 1001 Nights. From 775 to 809, the Caliphate experienced a surprisingly still period in its history. There were occasional scuffles in Egypt and Khorasan, as well as border wars with the Byzantine Empire, as well as a short-lived peasant revolt in northern Iraq in 770, but that notwithstanding, the Caliphate entered into a state of prosperity and peace for over 60 years. And if this podcast has imparted anything to you, it should be that this was no mean feat, given the many competing influences that the Caliph had to balance in order to run his dominions well. Harun al-Rashid in particular is praised for a long and successful reign, where the bulk of the Caliphate's wealth and power began to accumulate. Although there was just one exception in an otherwise excellent period of rulership. In 803, the Caliph shocked the elites of the new polity by having one of his best advisors executed and his friends imprisoned, ostensibly a reaction to the growing power of networks that the family formed. They were known as the Barmakids, Buddhists from Khazna in modern-day Afghanistan, that converted to Islam to serve the Abbasid government. The group consisted of the Wazir Yahya ibn Khalid ibn Barmak and his sons Jafar and Al-Fadl. Arguably, like the general his grandfather had executed in 755, Harun al-Rashid sought to limit his obligations to potential sources of power at the court. But this stands out as one blemish on an otherwise excellent rule. Therefore, the first three caliphs enjoyed a surprisingly peaceful start to their reign, in which time their territory was able to bloom and develop into a serious world power. Sadly, though, as is often the case throughout history both within and beyond the Islamic world, peace was not to last. In 809, Harun al-Rashid died, anointing his son Al-Amin as his successor, and his second son Al-Mamun to succeed the throne after that, in keeping with the caliphal custom of anointing two consecutive successors. Al-Mamun, however, was anointed as governor of Khorasan, the homeland of the Abbasids, as well as the Abna army that carried them to power. This region for some time now had hoped to become independent, angry that it was being increasingly left out of the centre of power by the new Baghdadi elite. Now, with a caliphal candidate on their side, they had a very strong claim to mount against the growing centre of power in Iraq. The Khorasanis marched on Al-Amin's army and defeated them. Al-Mamun's general Tahir ibn al-Hussein then marched on Baghdad, where the army was able to take over, with the legitimacy of Al-Mamun propelling them to power. They initially set up capital in the Silk Road city of Merv in present-day Turkmenistan, but after a bloody year-long siege, Baghdad fell in 813 to the new Caliph, with El-Amin fleeing to exile. This aggressive power grab, however, unleashed a colossal civil war between the two competing Caliphs that would rage on for the best part of 20 years intermittently. Baghdad revolted, calling on Harun al-Rashid's brother Ibrahim to take power in lieu of Al-Mamun. Support for Ibrahim spread west to the Levant and Egypt, where factional fighting broke out from 812 to 832. Egypt in this period was also beset with riots from other sources, most notably a sizable revolt against the jizya poll tax from the country's Coptic Christian communities in 819. Al-Mamun also had to revoke his first choice for caliphal successor in a remarkable turn of events that we'll explore in a few moments. This was an extremely dangerous blow to the Caliph's authority too, as it laid down the principle that a province could reject the rule of an illegitimate Caliph if they felt that they were being governed wrongly. There was also a remarkably religious element to Al-Mamun's caliphate that marred his reputation irrevocably as one of the most controversial Caliphs of this period. There are two key events to the controversy that the Caliph unleashed: anointing a Shia Muslim as his successor, and attempting to set a legal precedent that went seriously against the scholarly consensus at the time. To turn first to the succession controversy, Al-Mamun was keen to reconcile the Sunni-Shia divide, and when he came into power in 813, he had a radical idea to resolve this split that had now rocked the Islamic world for over 150 years. In 813, he declared the Shiite leader Ali ibn Musa as his first caliphal successor, even giving him the ruling name El-Rida, meaning the chosen one. Although well-intentioned, this decision exacerbated the fighting as a result of the civil war between him and Ibrahim, and he would later have to revoke the decision in 819 in order to quell the tensions that were mounting against him. This, however, seemed comparatively small in the face of the second move that Al-Mamun would make in the religious field. The Caliph was also very fond of an emerging school of thought in Baghdad, known as Mutazilism, a fringe intellectual movement that believed that Quranic study could be complemented by formal logic and reasoning, derived from ancient Greek philosophical texts that were being transported to Baghdad and translated into Arabic, meaning that the traditional, literal interpretation didn't necessarily hold water as well as people thought it would. This went in stark contrast to the majority of mainstream schools in this period, that favoured a more conservative, literal interpretation of the Quran that rejected innovations or alternative interpretations. And as such, this was deeply unpopular within the scholarly circles of the period. For the new Caliph, though, this new school was highly appealing. In 829, the Caliph even tried to impose, as a decree across the Caliphate, adherence to the Mutazilite idea that the Quran was a created document during the time of the Prophet, instead of a timeless scripture that had been with God before the universe. And he did this in order to settle a debate over the issue that had erupted as a result of an increased Mutazilite presence in the caliphal court. This was then taken further from 833 to 847, when the Caliph went as far as to order an inquisition, known as the Mihna, of the ulama, or scholarly community, to determine who was loyal to the new doctrine and who wasn't. This resulted in the imprisonment of a number of high-profile scholars, including the founder of one of the biggest schools of thought in this period, Ibn Hanbal. And it may interest the listener to know that when Ibn Hanbal was put on trial, he in fact had to be released a few months later when the people of Baghdad started to riot over this controversial decision. So, needless to say, this was an extremely divisive move, given the grounds on which the Abbasids took power. Not only was the Caliph trying to push forward a fringe ideology, but he was also trying to lay down his own precedents independently of hadith, something that the Umayyads, as you'll recall, were explicitly criticized for doing. By this time, the idea had taken root amongst the elite that the only legitimate sources of religious authority were the Quran and hadith, as interpreted by the community's scholars, or ulama. For al-Ma'mun to therefore try to push back against this went against the grain of acceptable models of legitimacy, and he has since gone down in history as one of the most controversial rulers of his age. I'll pause here to say that this dramatic sequence of events is considered a unique point in the history of Islam, as it's a rare example of a dispute over doctrine, orthodoxy, and heresy in the Islamic world. As we have already seen, divisions in the Islamic world tended to revolve more around political legitimacy rather than questions of belief, and the faith lacks the broad differences in creed and practice that tend to be more common in Christianity, for example. This is therefore a curious example of an instance where doctrine became grounds for argument in the Islamic world. And putting aside the fact that it was certainly devastating, this is without a doubt a unique point in the history of Islam's religious development. That being said, al-Ma'mun was able to eventually weather all of these challenges to his authority surprisingly well by balancing his network of power, as well as relying on the efforts of his highly talented wazir, a Khurasani general known as Tahir, whose family maintained the office from 821 to 873. He also introduced a number of reforms, including balancing the Abna in his army with militia levies from Iran, known as the Ayyarun, formed by increasingly influential Iranian elites who were loyal to the regime. He also introduced a number of non-Islamic peoples who were tied to the caliphal armies by military loyalty alone, making them highly loyal to the centralized army of the Caliphate. These were groups that included some Berbers, Africans from the Zanj coast near modern Tanzania, Greeks, Slavs, Caucasians, as well as Turkic peoples. The result of this was to create a professional and highly loyal fighting force that until 847 served as an effective fighting force for the Caliph. Baghdad, too, continued to flourish in this period. From the acquisition of Silk Road cities, trade began to proliferate, and the major cities of the Caliphate raked in unprecedented quantities of wealth. Sources in this period mention, too, that cities in this period started to specialize in specific kinds of trading goods. We know, for example, that Basra came to be known for its pearls and silk, while Nishapur in Central Asia specialized in goods such as pistachios and pomegranates. The wealth continued to grow as a number of steppe-dwelling tribes in Central Asia began to convert to Islam through Sufic missionaries, and began to sell valuable furs for wearing and export, in addition to the proliferating Viking trading routes in the 9th and 10th centuries that allowed amber, wax, honey, silver, and slaves to flow freely from northern and eastern Europe to the Islamic world. With an increasingly powerful center of government and trading network, lots of other states began to take interest. The two big empires of Europe, Byzantium and the Franks of Central Europe, both established diplomatic envoys to the Caliph, anxious of the power that a neighbor like this could command. This resulted in some remarkable cultural exchanges, including the giving in 796 of an elephant to the Frankish court in Aachen by Harun al-Rashid. As the period went on, diplomacy became increasingly important. In 836, a pleasure palace known as Samra was established that would provide the Caliph with a lavish center of power until the messy events of the 860s. More on that later. Ceremony became increasingly important in this period, with guests eventually being treated to a fine procession around the full palace when visiting on politics or business, seeing the entirety of the household staff and all of the Caliph's treasures. And some of these treasures, if our sources are to be believed, were absolutely extraordinary. We even have records of a silver tree that sprayed perfume and imitated the sound of birdsong through pneumatics. From the 920s onwards, this became more important still, as the Caliph began to compete with both Byzantium and the Franks, both of which, incidentally, enjoying a resurgence of power from the 10th century onwards, as well as rival caliphates that had emerged in Egypt and Moorish Spain at the time. This period saw a sharp increase in diplomatic activity, as well as the consumption of precious materials such as gold, silk, and ivory, as rulers sought to outdo each other. It's perhaps no surprise then that Harun al-Rashid had the audacity to write in correspondence to the Byzantine emperor that, and I quote, "The least of my lands, ruled by the least of my subjects, provides a revenue larger than your whole dominion." A stinging riposte to be sure, but one that at the start of the 9th century seemed to be increasingly true, as this city and the network of power it generated began to take shape. Scholarship in the city would eventually go on to thrive as well. Experts in philosophy, theology, law, poetry, administration, history, medicine, natural philosophy, and geography came about, producing a remarkable corpus of texts that outweighed anything that the Western world had produced since the zenith of ancient Rome. This remarkable growth in learning was driven by a couple of core factors. The growing interest in Sunnah and Hadith from the 8th century had sparked a keen interest in all sorts of different subjects to be able to allow scholars to be able to effectively write and develop their legal opinions. In addition to theology and philosophy, the ulama also began to take an interest in grammar, poetry, and philology to construct elegant and effective arguments, as well as formal logic to be able to structure their cases. In addition, learning was also improved by the translation of ancient texts into Arabic. In 830, the Beit el-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, was established, in which Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac works covering philosophy and science began to be translated. Naturally, this resulted in a substantial growth of knowledge, as the learning of three great ancient civilizations was synthesized together during this period. Strives came thick and fast in several different fields. The Persian El-Biruni pioneered the idea in astronomy of the planets rotating around the sun, over 600 years before Copernicus, while the field of mathematics saw for the first time the use of Sanskrit numerals, financial and accounting methods that would be later adopted by the commercial empires of Venice and Genoa, the use of algebra and trigonometry, as well as the establishment of both the concept and application of the zero. And this was all the more remarkable, given that the only other civilization to have come up with this were the Mayans of Central America. This period also saw medical texts that covered a broad range of topics such as diagnosis, the formulation of medicine, and the link between the brain and the senses, pioneered by Dr. El-Haytham. This was also the period of the great polymath Abu Ali Hussein ibn Sina, or Ibn Sina for short, who wrote authoritatively on several areas both in the arts and sciences. We will come back to him in more depth in the next episode, where we learn more about Al-Andalus. What is perhaps most remarkable about this is the curiosity to learn and the willingness to explore new ideas, test from first principles, and use formal methods of experimentation in order to find answers. This approach to learning would only emerge substantially again in Europe during the 18th century, at the start of the scientific revolution. Scholars in this period were certainly proud of this. The essayist Al-Jahiz from Basra noted the willingness of intellectuals in his own time to not allow religious dogma to get in the way of discovery and progress, and comments wryly on the way that the same could emphatically not be said for Europe in this period, where, unfortunately, academic curiosity was being denounced as vanity and sin, and ancient Greek texts were being erased and written over to make way for the creation of Bibles by monks. It wasn't just the sciences that thrived, though. This period also saw a flourishing of art and poetry, and two fascinating examples of this might include the poet Rabia Balkhi from Afghanistan, as well as the surprisingly racy poet Mahsati Ganjavi of what is now Azerbaijan. From this, there also began the establishment of a corpus of literature that gave birth to a renewed elite identity, known as adab. This was similar in some ways to the corpus of Latin texts that were widely known amongst the elites of the Roman world, or the 5 classics of Han China that form the basis of courtly culture and the imperial examination system. Adab referred to a sort of learnedness in literature, scholarship, and storytelling that was a prerequisite to breach into the culture of the elites of the caliphate. This included knowledge of Arabic, as well as rhetoric, storytelling, and stylistic recitals, as well as things like letter writing, memorization of the Quran, and knowing facts about the Arab world. It's also worth mentioning that religious learning began to soar in this period as well. In the Sunni world, a number of different schools began to emerge amongst the ulama that reacted differently to both the Islamic faith and the growth of learning in this period. Issues such as the unity of God, his essence versus attributes, and the divide between free will and providence, known as maktub in Arabic, were all debated by the brightest minds of the caliphate in this period. 4 major schools emerged: those of Abu Hanifa, Malik, al-Shafi'i, and Ibn Hanbal, each with their own stance. Ibn Hanbal's students, for example, were more conservative, favouring a literal interpretation of scripture, while Abu Hanifa's were more open to the use of human reasoning and non-Islamic philosophy when studying the Quran. This is partly why, as you may recall, the sources from the earliest years of Islamic history are so difficult to work with. Many were written by competing schools who all wished to stake their claim to the true version of events. Many too were patronized by different players in the political crises that racked the caliphate in this period, also adding to the partisan nature of some of these works. These schools would continue to fight amongst themselves until roughly the 10th century, when a general consensus was reached whereby no new innovations would be added to the law. It would henceforth be set in stone. Shi'ism was starting to take shape in this period too. Twelvers began cursing the Rashidun caliphs with the exception of Ali, and in 964 for the first time, the festival of Ghadir Qum was established, where the Prophet allegedly called upon Ali to be his successor. Therefore, by 847, the caliphate continued to be in a strong position. It is here, however, that the cracks in their power began to emerge. The principal issue that later caliphs would face was the large number of non-Muslim mercenaries in the caliphal army, chief among which were the bands of elite Turkish soldiers that became increasingly important in the management of caliphal lands. Being so close to the seat of power, and being propped up by the vast sums of money that the caliph racked in annually from taxation, these groups were both resented by local elites for their proximity to the centre of power, and in an excellent position to take advantage of the caliph if he proved unable or unwilling to meet their demands, rather like the Praetorian Guard of ancient Rome. In the 850s, one such incident broke out when the Caliph Al-Mutawakkil betrayed them in a heated court dispute. The Turks responded by murdering him in 861, and then until 870 held de facto rule over Baghdad, with a stream of caliphs that were raised and assassinated in line with the faction's demands. This was only stopped when the military strongman Abu Ahmad al-Muwaffaq took control of the faction and reinstated a new caliph in Baghdad. This also incidentally saw the end of the caliph's residence in the pleasure palace of Samra, where the Turks were able to isolate the caliph from the rest of the city to further consolidate their control. This was far from the end of the caliph's troubles, though. From 870 to 908, revolts became more common amongst the caliphate in Iran and Egypt, from local elites who were annoyed at the concentration of power and the increasing tax burden that provinces had to bear. One of the most dramatic of these occurred from 879 to 883, when slaves from the Zanj coast established an independent Shiite state in Iraq until it was broken up by the caliph's armies. This would go on to be one of the biggest slave revolts in history until the revolution in Haiti in 1791. The caliph's armies were able to deal with the majority of these uprisings, but the frequency of the rebellions over an extended period of time began to drain the caliph's funds and, in turn, its ability to manage its expenses. It certainly didn't help either that when the army didn't feel that things were going their way, they'd take over and run areas for themselves. In 862, for example, a Turk known as Ahmad ibn Tulun took over Egypt as its governor. This period of revolt was then followed from 908 to 920 by a period of an ineffectual caliph known as Al-Muqtadir, in which his wife Shagab overtook many of the functions of state in the power vacuum that emerged from his ineffectual rule. Although Shagab was undeniably good at her role, and was very generous in terms of her religious endowments, her entry into power was met with scandal, and in this period provinces began to slip away and govern themselves. Iran, for example, became a constellation of minor powers, as local potentates took over the city of this wealthy and influential region. Worse was to come. At the start of the 10th century, a remarkable challenge to the caliph's power took root. In and amongst the new minor states created by the waning of Abbasid power came two rival claimants to the title of caliph: the ruler of Al-Andalus, or Moorish Spain, the Umayyad prince Abd al-Rahman III, as well as, more shockingly, the Shiite Fatimid family that came to power in Egypt 20 years prior. In addition to this, a number of ebullient minor dynasties began to rise in prominence, such as the Ghaznavids in Afghanistan, Buyids in Iran, Hamanids in Aleppo, Karamita in Arabia, Aghlabids in Tunisia, and these deserve a special mention, as the Aghlabids managed to invade and take over Sicily in the mid-8th century, and hold on to it until the Norman conquest of the island in the mid-11th, as well as a second Shia dynasty in the form of the Idrisids of Morocco. This was concerning, to say the least, and was testament to the waning influence of the caliph's power at the time that people were able to so freely challenge his unique claim to be successor of the Prophet. Additionally, the state began to lose revenue fast as taxation was lost, which, when exacerbated by poor financial planning and a string of subpar caliphs, severely undermined the capacity for the caliph to effectively govern. From 945 onwards, the court in Baghdad was forced to rely on the Shiite Iranian general Ahmad ibn Buwayh to take over the army and settle the declining caliphate's spiraling issues. At this point, the caliphate's authority was only just around Iraq, with rival princes ruling the different regions on their own terms. The final nail in the coffin came in 1055, when a band of Turkish mercenaries known as the Seljuks took over the caliphate, declaring themselves de facto rulers of the Islamic world. This group was able to take advantage of the increasingly chaotic situation from the early 11th century onwards, by first offering themselves as mercenaries, and then as a conquering force as their land and influence began to grow. They still retained some deference to the caliph, though, and allowed him to stay on in a ceremonial role, with rulers of the Seljuks taking the title Sultan instead, analogous to king or conqueror. It is this group that would later go on to defeat Byzantium at Manzikert in 1074, causing the chain of events that would eventually give rise to the Crusades in Europe. To conclude, therefore, it's certainly hard to tell whether or not these issues could have fully been avoided. Lacking the infrastructure to manage a state of this size and complexity, it would have been no mean feat to balance all the competing interests necessary to make this enormous policy work. Arguably, the centralization of power outstayed its welcome too, and although effective in the short term, exacerbated tensions amongst an elite who felt increasingly cut out of power. It certainly didn't help either that the Caliph at this point had lost his position as a religious figurehead around which the entire Islamic world could rally behind. This caliphate fell, though, nevertheless, and with it came a new period in the history of Islam, where the provinces left behind would begin to forge their own path, with the occasional disruptions from influential, although short-lived, conquering powers. It's important to remember, however, that the central power in Iraq wasn't the only place of significance in the Islamic world at this time. And in our next episode, we're going to take a detour to examine the history of Al-Andalus, a second vital center of Islamic culture that underwent a remarkable rise and fall in this period, under the rule of what remained of the now exiled Umayyad dynasty. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next episode.